Thank you, Dr. Quinones. You can see two things from Dr. Quinones' talk. One is why there's such a passion from Dr. Quinones and his colleagues and from all of us about understanding this great genius and transformer who was Harvey Cushing, and also what an extraordinary department we have today, that we have people who are changing medicine and neurosurgery regularly and in an evolutionary kind of way. So there was a tremendous interest. We realized that our great heritage in neurosurgery at Hopkins is Harvey Cushing. And, I think all of organized neurosurgery looks at Johns Hopkins as where neurosurgery was founded. I tell the resident applicants when they come here that we live in a great historic place, but it really is not relevant in the sense of history is interesting to study and to learn from, but really what matters is what goes on today in terms of their training. Is it really, 100 years ago, great things happened, but what's happening in 2012? And is it the best place to train and the best place to work and is the best place to be a patient? So we think that it is, and we think that the current faculty would make Harvey Cushing very proud, just as we're very proud to come from his heritage. We really spent a lot of time thinking about establishing a Harvey Cushing lectureship and visiting professorship. And we thought that, again, it's this great privilege that we have that we're so connected to Harvey Cushing, his family, who established the Harvey Cushing chair, which I have the privilege of being the second incumbent to. Donlin Long was the inaugural Harvey Cushing professor. And since we bask in his light so much, we really thought a great deal about establishing this professorship. And Dr. Quinones was one of the people who kept really pushing, why don't we get this rolling and going? How can we not have a Harvey Cushing visiting lectureship? So once we, and after meeting with Amanda Burden, who's the deputy mayor of New York City, who works with Mr. Bloomberg, about our interest in doing this, and we decided to move forward. And then came this great responsibility: is who would we choose to really inaugurate this professorship? Who would be the person who could stand for the spirit of changing medicine and really transforming mankind through neurosurgery? And I asked everyone in the department, I asked the Dandy, Alumni Association, we surveyed to say, who would you nominate? Who would be the best person to kick off this professorship that would really represent the spirit and the accomplishments of Harvey Cushing? And all sorts of different names came in. If you try to think who is the greatest neurosurgeon living today that we could, or humanist, or scientist, or clinician in any field, that would be the appropriate choice. And of course, as we started looking at all the people critically, I realized, and all of us realized, that we actually were very fortunate and very blessed that we really had the best right here in our midst, and that we didn't need to really look around the world, that we had the best sitting here with us, with Dr. Carson. And I just want to take a moment. I think there's a very good background information about who Ben Carson is in the pamphlets that you've received in terms of listing some of the accomplishments. But I just want to tell you on a personal note that when I came here in 1984, Ben had just come back, had finished his residency here, and had come back from, he and Candy and her young family at the time, spending a year in Australia, and we both started on the faculty at the same time. In fact, we were both interested in brain tumors, and Al Owens called me into his office when I first started. I was recruited from Columbia, and he said he wasn't sure what Dr. Long was doing, but we had never, since Cushing, there hadn't been a brain tumor surgeon here specializing in brain tumors, and he didn't understand, and he was very, very happy that Ben was staying on faculty. He said, what on earth are we going to do with two of you here, both interested in brain tumors? And I had met Ben, and we had become friends instantly. And I said, I'm sure that it's going to be great. We're going to make it work, and we're going to really transform neuro-oncology by working together. And it has been a great ride. Ben has been a great friend to me in all these years, and eventually he moved towards focusing on pediatric neurosurgery and transforming that field, and on pediatric brain tumors and on incredible operations that he did. And I respected him enormously as a surgeon and as a colleague and as a friend, and as someone that we could talk about patients together and figure out what the best course would be. And I got to know him very well as a surgeon. Then one day, and I knew that he was interested in other things. I knew that he was never in Baltimore on a weekend, because he had written this incredible book called Gifted Hands about his story of growing up in Detroit, in the underprivileged and discrimination, and growing up with insecurity of not being able to get an education, but with his own dedication, his mother persisting and guiding him towards education, that he went on to go to Yale and then to Michigan and do a residency in neurosurgery. He was the 11th African-American neurosurgeon to be board certified in the United States. And with Gifted Hands, his biography has inspired millions of people. And we hear about that. It's the mandatory reading requirement in the city of Baltimore. It's really had an incredible transformative impact on children, seeing that they can do the impossible. They can overcome their backgrounds, and they can do anything that they set their minds to. And he set up the Carson Scholar Foundation and started saying that education should be focused on not just sports and not just other ways of sort of fast-tracking to success, but through education one could overcome discrimination and poor backgrounds. So I knew all of that, but then someone told me, you need to watch on C-SPAN, which I'm not a regular viewer of C-SPAN, the prayer breakfast at the joint session of Congress, and that Ben gave it that year. President Clinton was in the White House, and there was sort of a bootleg copy of it passing around the department. So I went home and I watched it, and I was simply stunned to see the other Ben Carson that I had never seen as a friend and as a co-worker in the operating room and at Hopkins. And that was how, in a joint session of Congress, he spoke about his vision for America, his vision for education, and it wasn't the same guy that we sort of worked with. It was this incredibly inspiring, dynamic, person, and he got a standing ovation 10, 15 minutes after he spoke, and I jumped out of my seat at home watching it and sent it to all family members and friends to see, like, wow. And I was trying to think, who is this Ben Carson? Who is this person who I never would have seen that side of, because there was never any special treatment that Ben asked for at Hopkins, except for people covering for him when he was running all over the country doing good things. President Clinton, who is a phenomenal speaker, got up to speak after Ben Carson, and after that rousing reception from a joint session of Congress, the Supreme Court, everyone else, who were truly moved, you could see by his speech. And President Clinton he was flustered. He said that he wanted to thank all the heads of state and the congressmen and everyone for coming, but he said he really would like to know who put him on the program following Dr. Carson, because he said he just didn't know what to do. He managed to get through, but in fact, it was a denouement. I had the privilege of joining the Carsons at the 2006 Springard Medal, which was the highest award given by the NAACP, where there were thousands of members of the NAACP in Washington. And I was amazed by what reverence Dr. Carson is held in the African-American community, and how important his model has been, and how important what he does day to day, his work, his mundane work with us, how important it was to the rest of the world who was watching. I also was very impressed that he didn't hesitate to criticize organized groups that were giving him honors and just tell it as he saw it, and to say there are things they were doing right and there are things they were doing wrong, and to share his vision. And he, again, had a rousing standing ovation. I was also very privileged to go to the White House and meet the President of the United States when Ben was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bush, which is the highest honor given to a citizen in the United States. And so on and so forth. There's so many great honors and great events. But most of all, I would say that Dr. Carson has changed neurosurgery, has changed medicine, has changed education in the United States. He's been a wonderful friend, a wonderful teacher in this department, and he's really thought about why we're doing what we're doing, and given us all inspiration and excitement about the day-to-day work. And I would say that one of the greatest privileges of being faculty member and now being chairman of this department is being able to walk side by side with Dr. Carson and many, many, many of the faculty members who are here who daily take on incredible challenges, as you saw Cushing do, who face death in their patients and yet think clearly, give the best possible medicine, and are constantly looking to improve on that. So it's, for me, a great, great honor to introduce our newly minted grandfather and to have him give this inaugural lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. This is indeed a tremendous honor to give this particular talk. I have an opportunity to give lots of talks all over the place, but very few of them feel like this, particularly in your own institution, where I've been roaming these hallways since 1977. And I particularly want to thank you, Henry, for inviting me to give this talk. Henry's the Harvey Cushing professor and should be giving this talk himself, but was gracious enough to ask me to do this. And I've known Henry now for 3 decades, and he's one of the wisest people ever that I've ever met. And to the extent that some years ago, before he became chairman, and he was thinking about leaving and going somewhere else, I was going to go with him. So it gives you some idea of how important he has been in my life. And the other person who really has played a huge role in my neurosurgical training is Dr. Donlin Long, because as a resident, watching him approach things in a fearless way. It really didn't matter what it was, he would just say, well, we can take care of that. And, I just, sort of inculcated that, and got to the point where I started believing that maybe you could take care of just about everything. Now, why neurosurgery? Why did I decide to become a neurosurgeon? Well, I always wanted to be a doctor of some type. And initially, it was a missionary doctor, because I would hear all the stories in church, Sabbath school, about these missionary doctors who would go all over the world, great personal sacrifice, bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people. I said, it's the most noble thing a person can do. And that was my goal from the time I was 8 years old until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, neurosurgery was out and psychiatry was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like very rich people. They drove Jaguars, had these big fancy mansions, big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And, I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And then I majored in psychology in college. I did advanced psych in medical school. And I was gung-ho. I was going to be the greatest psychiatrist in the world. And then I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? No, I just kidding. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I discovered pretty quickly was what psychiatrists did on television and what they did in real life were two completely different things. They're actually some of the more intellectual members of the medical community and people that I greatly admire, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do. And I had to stop and ask myself, what are you really, really good at? Because I believe everybody is particularly good at something, special gifts and talents that God has given them. And I started thinking back over my life, and I realized I had a lot of eye-hand coordination and the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person, never knocked things over and said, oops. It's a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things. And I said, you would be a terrific neurosurgeon. And it was a strange choice, many people thought, because at that time there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. And when I declared that that's what I wanted to do, some people thought it was pretty strange. But, you know, the people at the University of Michigan, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Tarrin, Dr. McGillicuddy, they all thought, absolutely, you should do this. And it seemed like a very, very natural thing for me to do. Well, interestingly enough, how did I end up coming to Johns Hopkins? Because getting into the neurosurgery residency at Hopkins is an extraordinarily difficult thing. And back in those days, they only took 2 people a year out of 125 applicants. So how did you get to be one of those 2 people? Well, it turns out when I was in high school, I had sort of gone astray, become a horrible student because of the peer pressure, but I got back on the right track. And I was an A student again. And I wanted to be a contestant on my favorite TV program, GE College Ball. Anybody remember GE College Ball? Yeah, there are a few old people here. You know, I love GE College Ball. It came on every Sunday, 6 o'clock. They pitted 2 colleges against each other, asked questions, science, math, history, geography, virtually everything. And I was gung-ho. I was going to be on it. The problem was they also asked questions about classical music and classical art. Now, at Southwestern High School in inner city Detroit, if you said something about Van Gogh, they would have said, put gas in it, the van will go. I mean, they would have had no idea what you were talking about. So, you know, I had to make an executive decision to learn all these things on my own. I would get on the bus, go downtown to the Detroit Institute of Arts, day after day, week after week, month after month, roam through those galleries until I knew every picture, who painted them, when they were born, what period it represented, listening to my portable radio, Bach, Telemann, Mozart. Kids in Detroit thought I was nuts. A black kid in Motown listening to Mozart? And I tried to convince people the Mo in Motown was for Mozart, but nobody was buying that. And I even decided which college to attend based on that program, because I had enough money to apply to 1 college. And I said, I'm going to apply to the college that wins the grand championship in college ball. Well, the grand championship that year was between Harvard and Yale. And Yale just demolished Harvard. So I didn't want to go to school with a bunch of dummies, so I applied to Yale. And fortunately, they accepted me with a scholarship, and off I went thinking I was the smartest person in the world, or at least in the top 5. But it wasn't long before I was severely disabused of that notion. But interestingly enough, later on I went to medical school, and then, you know, I said, if I'm going to train in neurosurgery, I should go to the place that's best known for neurosurgery. And where is that? Of course, Hopkins. Cushing, Dandy, Walker, the biggest names in neurosurgery had all been at Hopkins. So I said, there must be something really special about that place. So I said, I'm going to apply, even though I only take 2 people a year out of 125 applicants. Well, when I came for my interview, the person in charge of the residency program at that time was George Udrahai. Many of you may remember him. He was also in charge of cultural affairs at the hospital. And during the course of the interview, after we talked a little bit about neurosurgery and medicine, somehow the conversation turned to classical music. And we talked for over an hour about different composers and their styles, conductors, orchestras, orchestral halls. The man was on cloud nine. There was no way he wasn't going to recommend me for the program, because he had to have somebody to talk to about these things. And Don Long agreed with him. And so it worked out that I ended up here at Johns Hopkins. And one of the things that happened that I think really had a profound effect on the rest of my career is when I was chief resident in 1982, we had the grand opening of the Neuroscience Center in the Meyer building. And since Hopkins is the modern birthplace of neurosurgery, everybody who was anybody in neurosurgery was here, including Brian Stokes from Australia. And he kind of took a liking to me and said, you should come to Western Australia to be our senior registrar in neurosurgery. And I was thinking, Australia? Are you kidding me? Why would I go to Australia? I mean, you drill a hole in Baltimore, you come out in Australia. I don't want to go to Australia. Plus, I had heard they had a whites-only policy, so I kind of poo-pooed the idea. I didn't say that to him, but this is all what was going through my mind. And it seemed like every time we turned around, there was somebody saying, good eye, mate, how you going? We kept running into Australians everywhere. They seemed like nice people. Every time we would turn the TV on, there was a special on about Australia. And I told Candy, you know, I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia. So, you know, we sold all of our earthly belongings, and off we went to Australia. Our friends were saying, you'll be back in 3 weeks. But little did they know we didn't have any more money, so we couldn't come back even if we wanted to. But, you know, when I got to Australia, you know, the biggest problem we had was keeping up with all the dinner invitations. They love Americans over there. And probably the second biggest problem is every time I sat down and started writing in a chart, invariably someone would come up and say, do you mind if I feel your hair? And I would say, you can feel it, but it's going to cost you $10. Figured I'd get my airfare back home. But I would always get back at them because I would tell them I couldn't remember any of their names because they all looked alike. But, but it turned out to be a great experience because there were only 4 neurosurgical consultants in all of Western Australia. And once they discovered that I knew how to operate, they took off for the private hospitals, left me in charge of the main teaching hospital. I was doing 3, 4, 5 craniotomies a day. And I got an enormous amount of experience in a very short period of time. So when I came back a year later and the position opened up for director of pediatric neurosurgery, Dr. Long and other powers that be said, you know, Carson's very young, but he certainly had a lot of experience, so why don't we make him the director of pediatric neurosurgery? And that's how it happened, and it was really quite interesting at that time. I got involved in all kinds of different things. One of the first ones was achondroplasia, skeletal dysplasia. Steve Kopitz, orthopedic surgeon, got me really involved in that. But, you know, one of the interesting things that was going on was that these achondroplastic patients had about a 7% incidence of sudden infant death. And we were always trying to figure out exactly what was going on. One of the geneticists who was here then, Claire Franco-Mano, was actually the one who actually discovered the locus of the gene for achondroplasia, which is also for several other disease entities. And the way that was discovered is whenever we operated on one of the achondroplastic patients, we took some of the cartilage and we submitted it to her laboratory. That was through that they actually were able to make that discovery. But what actually happens with achondroplasia, for those of you who are not neurosurgeons, this is the normal foramen magnum at the base of the skull, and this is what it would look like in an achondroplast, even though the brainstem, the spinal cord, are the same size. So you got the same size cord trying to squeeze through this small diamond-shaped hole, and that was compressing the respiratory centers, and this is why we were in fact experiencing the high mortality. Before we had MRIs, we were doing all kinds of fancy reconstructions and tomograms and things like that, but you can see the spinal cord right here, the contrast material here, and you can see how narrow it can actually get right at that junction. So understanding that, it's not hard to understand why you had that problem. And then later on, with the advent of the MRIs, it became very apparent what was going on in these patients. And it was interesting because in 1986, I went to the first international conference on human achondroplasia in Rome. And interestingly enough, it was well attended by geneticists and neurologists, neurosurgeons from all over the world. And I was advocating surgery. And surgery was not a popular thing in those days. In fact, the geneticists felt that the surgeons were the ones who were more responsible for killing these patients than the natural disease. And it was largely because these areas were so tight and people would insinuate the normal types of instruments into the canals, and that would acutely increase the pressure in that very small foramen, and then they would swell and die after that. And one of the things that we had started doing here at Hopkins is putting together a multidisciplinary team. Neurosurgery was only one component. We had neurology, we had genetics, we had anesthesia, we had ENT, we had orthopedics, and a lot of this stemmed from the fact that you had people here like Victor McCusick and that whole genetics network. And that's one of the themes that I'd like to emphasize throughout the night. One of the reasons that I have been able to have a pretty interesting career is because I was here at Hopkins. Because you have enormous resources from which to draw on in virtually any discipline. And when you have general excellence across the board, it really empowers you to be able to do a lot of different things. So, you know, we really started advocating, instead of putting instruments under the bone, using high-speed drills and just drilling the bone away till it was very, very thin like a potato chip, chipping it off, taking off the membrane. And by doing that, we didn't cause an increased morbidity. And when I presented that at Rome, there was outrage. And, you know, many people, I mean, I thought they were going to hang me or something. But, you know, over the course of time, this has become standard in virtually every place around the world now. And it's been very, very gratifying to watch that happen. Some other interesting things happened to me while I was in Rome. I was mugged for the first time when I was there. Now, that would seem strange, growing up in Detroit and in inner city Boston and getting through all of that. And, you know, there I am in Rome, walking down the street, and Sumio Uematsu, we were going to go out and get something to eat. And these gypsy girls, you know, and they surround you. And I knew they were up to no good, and I was saying, get away, whatever you got, I don't want it. And they got Sumio, and they got all of his money. And I was saying, oh, poor Sumio. I said, don't worry, I'll buy lunch for you. And I reached in my pocket to get my traveler's checks. They were gone. And I'm like, airline tickets were gone. They are really good. They're really good. And, you know, I went to the police, and I said, well, you know, help. And they said, there's only one thing you can do. They said, what you have to do is you have to grab one of them, and you twist their arm. And then the other ones will bring back whatever they took. I said, that sounds fairly dangerous. I think they can just have it, whatever it was. But that was a very interesting experience. And I had some other good experiences there, too. But we also started recognizing that a lot of the people with achondroplasia ended up in wheelchairs. And of course, that was because they had tremendous spinal stenosis. And, you know, in a normal spinal canal, you know, it actually widens from the lumbal to the sacral region, but in the achondroplast, it narrows. It gets extremely narrow at the lumbal-sacral junctions. And as a result of that, they can end up with incredible stenosis. And for a long time, people were not doing anything about that because they just felt that it was a natural progression. And that was something, again, that was really advocated and pushed both on the adult and the pediatric side here at Johns Hopkins. And on the pediatric side, one of the things we discovered is that about 50 to 60% of the patients a few years later would have additional problems. And it was because of instability of the spine, because in order to be able to get a good decompression, you had to remove part of the facet joint as well. So now we fuse virtually all of those patients. And I think, we've written a number of papers about that, and that has now become the standard way of treating them. And it's very gratifying to see that most people with achondroplasia, if they're in the hands of a good multidisciplinary group, now have the possibility of leading long and relatively normal lives. And the same is true for many of the other types of skeletal dysplasia. And of course, Hopkins remains right at the forefront in treating all of those kinds of diseases. As far as the craniofacial program, and I should point out that when I became director of pediatric neurosurgery, I was pediatric neurosurgery and had to deal with virtually everything. And there weren't all the usual programs that you find. So we had to be in the process of developing those. And the craniofacial program was one that was really inspired by Craig Dufresne, who was a plastic surgeon, was actually an intern here with me, and then went to New York, NYU, where he trained, came back and joined the faculty here, and really brought a lot of interest in the craniofacial program. He subsequently left, and then Paul Manson and Craig Vanderkook took over in helping to do that, and dealing with not only the routine types of craniofacial issues, but also we were one of the people who really started pushing very hard for conservative treatment of what was felt in the early 90s to be an epidemic of lambdoid craniostenosis, babies with flat heads. And a lot of them were being operated on, and we operated on some of them too, but then we started thinking about other ways to do this and recognizing that they didn't really have craniostenosis and that a lot of them had torticollis. And I know some of you don't know these terms, but disproportionate shortening of one of the sternocleidomastoid muscles, which makes the head turn toward the other side. And then, pediatricians started telling everybody to avoid sits, to put your baby on their back to sleep. So you had a certain number of babies who were on their back to sleep, whose heads were turning and their heads were flattening, and people were misinterpreting this. And so we started working with the occupational therapists to work with the parents with muscle exercises and to create little foam pads that they could lay on that would redistribute the weight, and found that we could treat virtually 90 to 95% of those patients that way. And today we also use the dock bands, but very seldom do those patients require surgical intervention anymore. And of course, we began doing a lot of the very complex craniofacial problems too, and continue to do those. And much of that work now has been taken over by Dr. Ahn and Dr. Dorfshar. Both Dr. Jallo and I still do some of it, but I believe that those individuals will take the craniofacial program, which is already quite excellent, to the next level. Now, while all this was going on, there were a lot of other significant activities going on in my life. One of the things that helped tremendously was when Dr. Michael Guarneri came on as a research assistant for pediatric neurosurgery, and helped with the establishment of our brain stem tumor models, and helped gather information and write up some of our clinical papers, and put forward our Children's Cancer Foundation grants, which over the course of the years has amounted to millions of dollars. And then taking that to yet the next level, some years ago, Dr. Greg Riggins came, and is just a world-class, phenomenal scientist, And we've been able to benefit very, very significantly from his work as well. But I alluded a while ago to the fact that when I first became director of pediatric neurosurgery, I was pediatric neurosurgery, on call 24/7, all the time except for when I was out of town. So I made it a point to go out of town a lot so that I could get other people to cover for me. But, you know, they always were very willing to do so. But as a result of being on all the time, you were extraordinarily tired sometimes. And there came a point in the 90s where I had been at the hospital operating every night for about 10 days. And I was so tired, I sent Ed Miller a letter, and it said, and he apologized for not being here. He was here very early, but he had to go over to another affair tonight. I would tell this even if he was here. I sent him a letter. I said, you know, Ed, I've been on call so frequently because of emergencies, and we don't have a mechanism for taking care of emergency cases. So you're always here at night. Carol James and I were here every single night, just constantly. We knew all the night staff by first name. And he at that point said, well, we don't have a good solution, so why don't I put you in charge of finding a solution? So, and we actually put together a committee, and that's how we came up with Room 1 as the emergency trauma room. And that obviously has made a tremendous difference in the quality of everybody's lives, and that theme has been improved upon, particularly as we go into the new building. But I should say something, if I'm going to talk about pediatric neurosurgery here, about physician assistants, because they have played such an incredibly important role in the development and in the establishment of pediatric neurosurgery. And, you know, starting with my senior PA, Carol James, who joined the neurosurgery department in 1982 when I was chief resident, and then came to work with me when I joined the faculty, and has been with me my entire career, and knows virtually all of my patients and helped develop all of these programs, and was a person who was here all of those nights when I was here 24/7. We'd be here until 10, 11 o'clock at night. And that kind of dedication and hard work on Carol's behalf played a major, major role in any success that we had. But also Judy, who's been here for over 20 years. The cast of characters changes from time to time now. We have Stephanie and Heather, but we've always had just such excellent people who've worked very hard, who get to know the pediatric side. Now we have the hospitalists as well, which has tremendously improved the quality of care for the patients. But we could not have had the success we've had without them. Now this is, I just wanted to talk about another aspect of Hopkins that is spectacular, and that is during our 7-year training program, 2 of the years are spent in the laboratory. And my project in the laboratory was to develop an animal brain tumor model. And I had 2 years to do that. Well, because of the tremendous collaborative efforts that I found in the oncology center, in the biochemistry department, in the research radiology department, we were able to establish a rabbit brain tumor model in 6 months. And all of the imaging capabilities, the regular duplication, the treatment modalities, and none of that would have been possible without the kind of collaborative efforts that we have at an institution like that. And, you know, I have many, many people that I could thank in lots of different departments, but I think it's a characteristic of one of the reasons that Hopkins is #1. It's because we, again, have the ability to collaborate so well together. And also in terms of the clinical research, you can see here some of my trigeminal neuralgia work. We're actually looking at the heat patterns on the skin. This is a laser Doppler in that previous picture, and that's some clinical work that is ongoing. And a lot of people were interested in how I got interested in trigeminal neuralgia as a pediatric neurosurgeon. When I was a third-year medical student, I noticed how much the neurosurgeons struggled when they were doing percutaneous rhizotomies, taking a long needle, for those who don't know, and passing it through the jaw, through the buccal mucosa and the muscles, to the base of the skull, right near the brainstem. And then you can coagulate or inject things. And getting it into the right place, they had a horrible time. And so as a third-year medical student, since I'd had a little experience as a radiology technician, and I had access to the equipment, I took some skulls and I figured out a way using rings that you could orient it in such a way that you could get the needle. And the neurosurgeons at Michigan were so impressed. And this was back in the days before we had fluoroscopy that was, you know, good enough, that was more than a Rorschach type fluoroscopy. So it really made a big difference. Now you can actually see things, so you don't need something like that. But it really kind of followed me from that point on. So when I joined faculty here, Carol and I started really becoming very interested in trigeminal neuralgia. Now it formulates a very large part of our practice.